welcoming the ambassador of Ireland, Fionnuala Gilsannon, who had an opportunity to visit the Greatmore site. It was a few months ago. So we're really grateful that you could join us this afternoon. And then the First Secretary, Evan Cunningham, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Eve Patten. Eve's promised, when we first met in Trinity, you said we would meet in 2020 in Cape Town, March 2020. And that's when lockdown happened. Yep. And that trip was postponed, and so we're really excited that you were able to make it to this winter school. Eve Patten is Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute and Professor of English at Trinity College Dublin, a scholar in 19th and 20th century Irish and British literature and cultural history. She's editor of the recent volume of essays, Irish Literature in Transition, 1940 to 1980, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and author of a monograph on representations of Ireland's revolutionary decade in English writing, Ireland, Revolution and the English Modernist Imagination, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. I should say that some years ago, our Vice-Chancellor and several colleagues in our executive visited Ireland, and I was told by someone who was at the hub. I also have my people at the hub who tell me things, you know.
Spies.
And they said, please don't show people at the CHR this building because they'll want one. You know, but that building, that facility, houses some of the most animated and carefully orchestrated and choreographed discussions that I've encountered in the humanities. So it's great that you're here with us. The lecture today is titled Ireland, England and the Paradox of Minor Literature. Welcome, Eve.
Thank you very much, Premesh. It's just a pleasure to have you chairing and to talk to everybody. And I do look forward to welcoming Premesh back to the Trinity Long Room Hub, but also some of you, some of the new friends that I've met over the past few days. I'd love to begin as well by thanking Heidi and the wonderful team who've put the winter school together. Just terrific. And to welcome, of course, Ambassador Fionnuala and Evan. Thank you so much for coming. And also for being so quick to support the, let's say, solidifying of an already strong relationship between Trinity and Cape Town, and particularly the University of Western Cape. So, where to start? Well, I am, as Premesh has described, a literary historian, and that sounds as if I'm confessing to being something like an axe murderer in this company. A rather mundane profession, I think, in the context of the wonderful discourses that I've been learning about over the last few days. But I did want to think for a little while this evening about what literary history and the literary history of Ireland and England together might have to say to the subject that we've been pursuing all week, this subject of the minor. But it's been a long day, so just as a favour to you all, I'm going to follow the excellent advice that the writer Cormac McCarthy gives out. Try to leave out the boring bits that people don't want to read. So I'm going to try and leave out the boring bits that people don't want to listen to. But let me start by a quote from the post-colonial theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty. Majority and minority are, as we know, not natural entities. They are constructions. Well, of course, that will seem self-evident to you, but nonetheless, I want to keep it in mind for this talk as I try to address what I think Chakrabarty is aiming at here. The changing protocols across time of minority histories, minority cultures. Some minoritized subjects become representational, they gain voice, others disappear. Minoritized subjectivities flex and evolve, or they're effaced according to the changing geopolitical landscapes in which they're formed. And this same instability comes across in the 2020 novel by Zoe Wickham, who offers very much a kind of keynote for the Winter School this year. And this is a novel, Still Life, which is very much about a kaleidoscopic review of colliding post-colonial subjects as they confront, imaginatively, their own history. In the very distant 1820s of this novel's past, the Scottish poet Thomas Pringle, who is the author of the much anthologized poem Afar in the Desert, exchanges what he calls a peripheral position on the border with England for a peripheral position on the edge of the Cape Colony to become, and I quote, the father of South African poetry. When we move to the baffling new world of the novel's present, however, and our present day, he is dethroned. He is vexed and angered at his relegation to being merely the father of colonial South African poetry, a newly minoritized identity with which he struggles to come to terms. What then is his role? This is from Wickham's novel. The slipperiness of being a subject. For instance, will he as a white man be expected to step aside? What to do about this talk of a dead white man that he does not understand? He has prided himself on his dealings with all manner of men, but has never before come across the category of white man. Well, Zoe Wickham's satire on Thomas Pringle and the other allegorical personalities of her time-travelling book illuminate the slipperiness of being a subject, which Tazuma spoke about so eloquently in the last session. Her cast of constructions, and these are constructions rather than characters, I think, slip ahead of the calcified definitions of subjectivity around which the discourse of minor literature circulates. The text, the foundation text of Still Life, Zoe Wickham's novel, is Virginia Woolf's 1928 work, Orlando, which you'll know to be that modernist picaresque of a man turning into a woman over the course of a 400-year history of Britain. And this reinforces her point that both major and minor discourses, whether we see them in terms of male and female or otherwise, are quintessentially volatile. They're subject to the flux of cultural evolution and geopolitical realignments. What we might once define as minor in Deleuze and Guattari's lexicon will not necessarily stay minor. And more troublingly, what we might once assume to be major is compromised by changes of fortune, political and economic, or undermined, as with Wickham's fictional white man poet Thomas Pringle, by deliberate failures of self-recognition, a deliberate self-minoritization. And I'm going to come back to this. So in this paper, I want to consider the slipperiness of major and minor discourse, and by way of Deleuze and Guattari's, admittedly, I think, very fossilized reading of Franz Kafka, to trace the application of the concept to literary history. And in this case, Irish and English literary history, because that's all I know. And I do so with due acknowledgement of the Winter School's warning notes. Minor literature, for me at least, is not coterminous with a minoritarian resistance in a political sense, except sometimes, nor is the minoritized subject a synonym for the subaltern. It does not endure what Gayatri Spivak, I think, in one of her more useful pronouncements, talks about as the subaltern's out-of-access condition. But there are, of course, liaisons between these items, and not least in their coexistence within that particular theoretical zone that overlaps the late and the post-imperial, the post-national, the globalized, and increasingly, and I want to come back to this too, the transnational. All of them are constructions. All of them are vulnerable to time. And in this talk, I want to try to travel by way of Ireland and England towards a contemporary landscape of a world literary discourse to address the global. And I'll do this in 3 parts. I know, it sounds ambitious, but I'll get there. Part 1, Lost in Time. How do major and minor operate together? I was very impressed by Tazama's confident archaeology of her own scholarly hinterland, her own disciplinary formation in the paper we heard earlier. And in a way, I want to try to do the same thing, to backtrack in scholarly time, to revisit my first acquaintance with the concept of minor literature. Back in 1987, a monograph appeared which, as academic books occasionally do, shifted the paradigms of what was then called Anglo-Irish literature. This was David Lloyd's Nationalism and Minor Literature, and it ingeniously adapted Deleuze and Guattari's 1975 reflections on Kafka in Towards a Minor Literature, which we've been talking about, to test out the forensics of minority literary discourse on the figure of a 19th century Irish poet, a kind of real-life contemporary of Zoe Wickham's fictional Thomas Pringle, the little-known James Clarence Mangan. Elusive, impecunious, tubercular, Mangan would haunt the libraries of Imperial and Victorian Dublin, penning disparate and fragmentary literary pieces spun out to appeal to shallow metropolitan tastes for the sentimental or the Gothic. He wasn't very good, or so it appeared, until in David Lloyd's brilliant reading, Mangan was successfully recast as the epitome of minority literary discourse. In this inspirational critic's hands, we came to recognize that in the poet's strategic cultivation of a fictionalized authorial personae, in his relentless pursuit of pastiche Orientalism, his parodies of Victorian sentimental verse, and his pseudo-translations of foreign language works that simply didn't exist in any original form, Mangan self-consciously provided an eccentric point of resistance, a proto-Kafkaesque literary identity that subverted, through literature, the dominant English canon, the major cultural discourse imposed upon Ireland through what was then 300 years of plantation and colonialism. Now, when David Lloyd's book on Mangan appeared, I was living in Dublin. I was just starting my PhD on 19th century Irish cultural history and trying to find some critical pathway through the subject and face into a tradition that had been defined very much as second-rate, second-hand, impoverished by the loss of the Irish language and geared towards poor imitations of the English canon that I'd studied as an undergraduate. It was waiting almost for that breach in the early 20th century of the nationalist literary revival and the work of W.B. Yeats. But here, suddenly, in this discourse-defining, paradigm-shifting publication, we had a revelation. 19th century Irish writing, it turned out, had its own closeted integrity, its own tactics of resistance. While appearing merely to imitate British literary models, an Irish writer was in fact engaging in a guerrilla campaign of what Deleuze and Guattari call effects: illusion, disguise, fragmentation, parody, and parody perhaps is the most important of these, deflection and evasiveness in a symbolic mobilizing of political resistance. Here was the basis for an Irish literature of a defiant neurosis, and that term, which I think came up earlier in Nancy's paper, is of course taken again from Deleuze and Guattari. Here it was, modelled in the melancholy journey of a consumptive and destitute alcoholic Irish poet towards his death in a Dublin gutter. Well, looking back over, 30 years later at that episode of critical conversion, it's really with a kind of nostalgia and a little bit of embarrassment for how simple it seemed to me then to transfer the conditions of Kafka's German-speaking Jewish Prague to Dublin's English-speaking Irish literati, but also how compelling it was to accept that this Hibernian turn to the minor literature thesis was in essence revolutionary, that it had a definable political agency, specifically, and this again has come up already, in the identification of the solo or the individual with the collective, the lonely poet representing the formative Irish nation as it pushed in the direction of independence. Deleuze and Guattari, as I think Dara outlined so well the other day on, the cinema panel, Deleuze and Guattari stress as one of their three preconditions for minor status, quote, the connection of the individual to a political immediacy. And indeed, they endorse this relation with very specific reference to Ireland in that third chapter of their dissertation on Kafka. And when I reread these paragraphs now, all the romance of that first acquaintance with this material floods back to me and remind me how young and naive I was. So I'm just going to read this bit. Still am. We might as well say, they write, that minor no longer designates specific literature, but the revolutionary conditions for every literature within the heart of what is called great or established literature. Even he who has the misfortune of being born in the country of a great literature must write in its language, just as a Czech Jew writes in German, or an Uzbekian writes in Russian, writing like a dog digging a hole, a rat digging its burrow. What a phrase. And they continue, since language is arid, make it vibrate with a new intensity, arrive at a perfect and unformed expression, a materially intense expression. For these possible paths, couldn't we find the same alternatives under other conditions in Joyce and Beckett? As Irishmen, both of them live within the genial conditions of a minor literature. That is the glory of this sort of minor literature, to be the revolutionary force for all literature. Now you can see how the word revolutionary is a kind of enchantment here, and of course rightly many skeptics of their thesis note how they overread Kafka's original 1911 thoughts on small literature, specifically for this political engagement, this political purpose. But for myself and for my fellow students of the late 1980s, all reading David Lloyd, all drinking a bit too much probably, we were seduced by it. And more than this, it spoke to the torrid Irish politics of the 1980s. This was a decade before the IRA ceasefires of 1994 and the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1998, a time when the political contingent pressed down very hard on a cultural narrative and on literary criticism itself. In this way, literature, or rather the management of literature, offered coded ideological positions. And this is something I know I don't have to explain to this particular audience. All of this predated what we now have, a much more sophisticated and nuanced post-colonial critique that rightly probes Ireland's First World complicity in the project of empire. Back at that point, Irish literature, it seemed, could be potently minoritized, and a clear line drawn from the 19th century Mangan to the 20th century Joyce, to those vibrating linguistics and materially intense expression that became Ulysses, or to the revolutionary soul of Joyce's autobiographical Stephen Dedalus, who you'll remember in A Portrait of the Artist, is the Irish everyman fretting in the shadow of the English language, and what a productive fretting that becomes. So the engagement of a minoritarian discourse to speak to an evolving Irish literary canon was really a product of its time, of that interlude when post-colonial readings galvanized Irish cultural debate, and Irish critics took their lead from Ashebe or from Fanon or from Said, but without qualification. In the decades since David Lloyd's very suave application of the minor literature thesis to 19th century Ireland, there have been many evolutions, I think, in how we think about the cultural politics of the island. Is there anything useful in these critical and literary transitions for our question of the minor today? Part 2, Lost in Transition. Let me return to my opening comments on slipperiness. Gayatri Spivak has warned, rightly, that we cannot have a full appraisal of power relations if we lack a critique of the sovereign subject, and this is one of the reasons she goes to war with Deleuze and Guattari. Within the dynamics of minor literary discourse, then, we only have a partial reading. We've only done half the job if we take our eyes off the partner element in the dyadic construction of the minor and major. And I'm going to just pause here to point out I'm taking a reckoning with the various discussions of minor arts that have been part of the Winter School in which this may not apply, in which we simply have a single focus. But I want to bring it back to the dyadic construction, or the double helix geometry, if you like, of the major and minor. And many of you will recognize that I'm stealing the double helix formulation not only from the structures of DNA, but from the groundbreaking work of Margaret and Patrice Higonnet back in the 80s, when they used the double helix diagram to explain the gender relations of the First World War. During the First World War, women were able to be ascendant, were able to gain authority, were able to get out of the house, earn their own money, take on power positions. But just as they did that, so in turn did the male figure move accordingly to contain that power advancement. So the double helix is a very useful idea, I think, to make us reckon with the fact that as the minor slips around, so too does the major perhaps change its positions, often strategically. In addressing minor literature, we can't let the major slip away. We need to consider how the minority status in which we invested for Irish writing over time has been compromised and even challenged by shifts in the condition of the major discourse. In the case of Irish literary history, I think we need to register and measure according to the tactical shifts of a parallel English cultural self-portrait. To bear in mind, again, my opening quote from Chakraborty, an English self-construction. Now, I explored something of this paradoxical turn, again from the perspective of literary history, in the recent book that Premish alluded to on Irish-English literary relations, in the context of an interwar late modernism. It seems terribly narcissistic to have brought the book along, but the reason for this is I wanted to leave a copy with Heidi, and much as I would like to be able to say it's available in all good bookshops, it's now been stuck because of Brexit at British Customs for the last 4 months. So my only consolation is that there are some customs officials out there who are now extremely well read in transnational literary politics. But what I wanted to talk about in this book was the way that English writing of the early to mid-20th century began to engage ideas of Ireland and Irish writing to express an English aspiration, yes, you've guessed it, to minority culture status. As many other literary historians have noted, in the wake of the First World War, through the very safe modals of the figurative and the metaphoric, a generation of English writers began to self-identify as minor. In a landmark book on this subject, A Shrinking Island by Jed Esty, and this book, which many of you may know from 2004, takes its title, The Shrinking Island, from Virginia Woolf's novel, The Voyage Out, in which as the ship sails away from the south coast of England, which is perceived as an island, it gets smaller and smaller. The island itself, England, begins to shrink. And in this book, Jed Esty tracks, in work by T.S. Eliot, E.M. Forster, late Virginia Woolf, and other writers of what he calls the late modernist imperial twilight, all the cultural hallmarks of an attempted, and indeed quite successful, self-minoritization. And this is visible, for example, in the kind of anthropological retreats that these writers create to native or folk models of English culture, in the way that they reconstruct enclaves of imagined villages, in the way that they draw on traditional and, again, folk pageant formats in their writing. All of these things whispering of a return to a manageable, feudal England, and particularly, I think, in the reclaiming of what they identify as an English peasant pastoral, borrowed very much from medieval sources. And they do this not only in literature, but of course in the visual arts, in song, music, and dance. Now, this turn to minority culture against the swelling tides of mass civilization, to invoke our friend F.R. Leavis, is, I think, a very recognizable form of a conservative modernism. And it's a reflex that's sparked by those disorientating effects of imperial expansion and overreach, a resultant need to find local definition as a defense against doing too much, as a defense against overambition. For me, such magical thinking signaled an English weariness, a fatigue with the project and the scale of the empire itself. And so enacted what we might think of as a kind of English self-decolonization. And I should have footnoted this much earlier by saying, I've nothing here against the Scottish or the Welsh, but this is very specifically about English cultural nationalism. These things are worked through an imaginative form, and the hallmark is these ersatz forms of minority discourse, very often borrowing from, modelled on, configurations in the nearest available example over in Ireland. Tactics borrowed from an Irish playbook include, in particular, the fetishised idea of retreat to the notion of being a small island. I'll come back to that. Of a constant refrain or impetus towards small house or cottage living. I cannot tell you the number of writers who at this period in the 1930s and early 1940s either move to a cottage, talk about moving to a cottage, or literally move to a cottage, very often in Ireland itself. Of bohemian anti-materialism and of a kind of cultural downsizing that's expressed in many ways. And I think some of this was perhaps enhanced by the post-armistice declaration by the League of Nations that Sam was talking about earlier, to protect and foster the interests of Europe's small nations. You get a small nation discourse running through this period. And it conveys a kind of existential chastening for England. I think it's beautifully summed up in the famous opening paragraph of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover from 1928. The cataclysm has happened. It's in the wake of the First World War. We are among the ruins. We start to build up new little habitats, to have new little hopes. And of course this leads to a whole retinue of writers, right up to J.B. Priestley and others in the 1930s and 40s, talking about the little England that they love. So England, English culture, English language indeed, and certainly English literature could be strategically provincialized, and again I'm drawing on Chakrabarty's terms here. In this reflex, a late modernist English culture could inhabit a figurative or a conceptual minoritarianism, even if this was, as it often was, in parodic form, and even in a language that simultaneously reconfirmed its major status. To gesture towards this idea of retreat from a political and metropolitan and imperial high ground, even while that craft was still going on, that statesmanship was still going on. To becoming what T.S. Eliot talked about, and he's one of the lead architects of this discourse, a vigorous small people, vigorous small people. So England could be imaginatively remade as a minor construction, resistant to the major discourse of British imperialism. English literature could then enact figuratively a revolutionary impulse of the kind we talked about earlier, as it struggled, and I'm quoting the critic Ian Bowcombe here, it struggled to define the relationship between the national here and the imperial there. I'm not going to go into detail on many of the attendant discourses that I think accompany this self-minoritization, but I think it's very interesting that one of the iterations of the minor that's come up so much in the last few days is that of the minor as child. And we heard it in Nancy's wonderful talk this morning in her use of Giorgio Agamben's infancy. But interestingly, of course, this is another aspect of this playbook, the idea that a retreat to Ireland or a gesture towards Ireland somehow metaphorically conveys an English will to go back in time to childhood. And there are so many quotations that I've found in working on the book that reinforce this. The idea that Ireland represents the childhood innocence, the playground that exists and is stopped in time before an English adult world of maturity and, of course, imperial difficulties, entanglements, responsibilities. So much of this turn to Ireland, which is both figurative and literal, a lot of writers moved to Ireland, particularly during the Second World War when Ireland was neutral, in a kind of disinheritance. In a longer discussion, I would suggest that the turning of the double helix here resonates, I think, very much with Zoe Wickham's dry exchange of the scramble for Africa with the scramble for alterity. And of course, this again provides a note for this year's winter school. But in the longer term, I think there are more sinister applications. This isn't just a kind of curiosity of literary history. Many of you, of course, have already thought, surely this leads in a very straight line to the small nation rhetoric that was spun out in the United Kingdom in 2016 as part of the Brexit campaign and was marshalled to the idea of withdrawing again to a self-protected island retreat that would be safe from European interference and responsibility. But I think there are other, and we can talk about them over the longer term, other, indeed much more sinister applications, strategic applications of the idea of England's and Ireland's minor imaginaries to a wider landscape, and a wider landscape of decolonisation. And again, I don't have to tell this audience about the use of configurations such as the Little Ulster in what was Rhodesia, or again, the use of Irish feudal figurative ideas in what was British East Africa in 1921 and 1922. So I think these ideas of being a reminoritized imaginary are extremely portable, extremely loaded, and can engage with the wider politics of decolonisation. But that's a bigger question. For now, we have an England which is strategically performing the role of its own interior minoritarian revolutionary. It's carving out what Peter Mandler calls a safe space in literary time. So here's the inevitable question. How do we read the slipperiness of being a subject against the grain of this fragmenting late imperial history if the major does not stay major, or more, will not recognise itself as major, like Zoe Wickham's Thomas Pringle, who will not recognise himself as a white man? Then how does the minor stay minor? I want to finish on a slightly different tack, and this bit is called Lost in Space. I struggled with these titles, honestly. When does the question of the minor become not one of time or transition, but of space? And to finish, I just want to think about literary space and worry at this a little bit in addressing the global. With the expansion of literary geography, there is, it seems, plenty of room for everybody. In her brilliant introduction to world literature from 2016, Debjani Ganguly describes global literary discourse as, I quote, a capacious rubric that functions across chasms and crossroads. It incorporates, I'm quoting, new cartographies, hemispheric, oceanic, trans-regional, archipelagic, multilingual, local, and it reflects in this variety the spatially dispersed nature of literary production. Spatially dispersed nature of literary production. Now, in this post-millennial critical and indeed commercial discourse, and I don't want to labour this, but this was brought up beautifully, I think, in the panel on cinema, where the question was asked, does a documentary remain minor once it's on Netflix? In this discourse, Ireland has done okay, thank you very much, has been very successfully positioned as a major player on the global literary stage. And in this, it builds on the legacies of Joyce, Beckett, and their modernist contemporaries. For those writers, a revolutionary impetus, that fracturing and vibrating of the English language that we heard about earlier, coincided usefully with the advancements of a metropolitan European modernism. And modernism, of course, is a hungry discourse, and it recruits the minor into the pantheon of the global very easily. Not only Ireland, but Romania, Spain, Mexico, and so on. Numerous very influential critical interventions on this subject that you know include Franco Moretti and his macroeconomic reading of the global space in Distant Reading, David Damrosch's work on global literature, and the one I want to come to briefly, Pascal Casanova's The World Republic of Letters, which was translated in 2004 into English. Casanova, in particular, invests in concepts of expansion and liberation in the global space. The World Republic of Letters, she writes, is defined by, quote, the enlargement of literary space that accompanies the spread of national independence. The enlargement of literary space that accompanies the spread of national independence. And she does attend, of course, carefully, following Edward Said, to the persistence of imperial and colonial hierarchies that do continue to compromise or exert power over minor national literatures in this space, to writers who are caught in a range of tensions between assimilation and publishing, translation and creolization, and of course, expatriation itself, which we've talked about briefly. But in general, Irish writing seems to be able to raise its head above the flux of a world literary system, following the example of the extraterritorial James Joyce, who, as we know, ruptured so effectively the protocols of a national colonial containment, that Ireland-England dyad, to gain ascendancy across Europe's modernist capitals and, of course, in the US. So today, for Irish writing, the idea of being global perhaps comes as something of a relief, the lifting of that curse of national conscience and the expectation of ethnic essentialism. But it still provides a route to a marketplace in which the long hangovers of nationalism and colonialism, partition, civil war, the Northern Irish Troubles, the legacy of a punitive Catholic Church, these can be carried over as a kind of imaginative capital into the global literary marketplace for comparative interpretation and assimilation. It's a little bit of a cynical comment, but we can tease it out. English remains the primary vehicle, but England, in its historical and hierarchical relevance, just falls away. That shrinking island, in the very sardonic words of a character in Brian Friel's play, Translations, England is overlooked. In globalization, the post-millennial expansion of literary space, Irish writing now, I think, has to suspend any residual or vestigial claims to being a minor literature. But what do other minor literatures become in this spatial evolution? A very attractive menu of terms presents itself to us. Françoise Lyonnais and Shumei Shi, who introduced their volume of essays on this topic, suggest that in dispensing with the dyadic, that major-minor hierarchy that we talked about earlier, the minor can become transnational, looking to lateral networks, not vertical battles. For other critics, minor culture becomes nomadic in its trans-territorial pursuit of cross-reference, comparativism, or translation. And for others again, and this includes Zoe Wickham, who's written beautifully on this topic, the minor is recruited to a new translocalism. Translocalism that situates minor cultures in contiguity to each other so that points of connection can be found and validated outside of a Western European and US hegemony. A structure of interlacing and overlapping to which I think the poetry of Seamus Heaney in particular lends itself beautifully. But are celebrations of these new critical semantics, these evolutions of how we think about minor literature, a little bit premature, even perhaps utopian? The fate of minority cultures in a global system remains to be seen. It's too early to tell. But I do take a note of caution from Ajay Skaria, who was responding in the 2021 Winter School in his lecture, The Subaltern and the Minor, to this subject. And he was extremely precise about the fact that the minority is not, and never will be, a majority in waiting. Minor cultures, minor literatures simply do not assemble on the world stage in some kind of collective power grab. Rather, they remain, in Skaria's words, interstitial. Now, this word came up in our discussion of puppetry, I think from Dara yesterday, with huge confidence, and I completely support that, and it made complete sense to the way in which the puppet figure does intervene from an interstitial position in human discourse. But across a wider terrain, I'm less confident in it. I checked the dictionary definition, very much like Tizama. I checked the dictionary definition of this as a medical term, interstitial, remaining in the spaces between cells, tissues, organs in the body. In other words, while there are many constructive options for minority writers recuperated within the global space, they remain in the spaces between. They don't collude in some kind of politicized resistance. And here we begin to sense that terrible anxiety about the enlargement of literary space and cultural space, to which Gayatri Spivak is constantly alert when she talks about the double bind of globalization and the high stakes of a world literature where hierarchies can silently reassert themselves. And I think we've heard enough today already to know that there is a new menacing major discourse on the horizon in the form of a global techno-capitalism and as to how the minor can combat that, we simply have no idea. So, again, Irish literature, to finish, raises its head easily above the fray, and paradoxically now, Ireland, I think, first of all, has to address its own internal minority discourses and must be alert to what it does in terms of commercial reminoritization at times. But as Casanova observes, writers in other post-colonial nations on the periphery of an international literary space have to struggle still, not only against the predominance of national politics, but also against international political forces of linguistic and economic domination. They haven't made the same ascendancy. To return to my opening, will the liberating concepts of transnational or translocal turn out in the end to be, like major and minor, merely constructions, not positions of political agency? In Zoe Wickham's still life, these processes of creation and recreation, of revision and strategic reinvention are made flesh, and it transpires that the unfortunate Thomas Pringle himself, that would-be minor poet, is, quote, no more than a cipher constructed by liberal English South Africans intent on distinguishing their polite racism from the crass Afrikaner version. Nothing is innocently done. So can the minority, in these new semantic formulations, retain or gain agency? Can it remain or gain revolutionary force in the company of fellow minor cultures without the antithesis of a visible majority culture and language? How does the individual retain that immediate connection to the political that Deleuze and Guattari herald in a thesis which I admit is riddled with deficiencies, but of which they speak so emphatically? Will the impetus that drives, or that did drive, a minor culture and its voice of fragmentary resistance, the dog digging its hole, the rat digging its burrow, to invoke Deleuze and Guattari again, will this become enervated or even effaced in the generous, accommodating, lateral, comparativist accommodations of the global arena, lost not only in time and transition, but also in space? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eve. That was just wonderful. And I heard, a very interesting way in which you're twisting that old essay that we sometimes forget by Jameson on Third World Literature's national allegory in a way that I think Ajay Ahmad didn't get to, and I really appreciated what you were doing. I think there's also a way in which what you're putting to us speaks so much to the kind of ambitions of the Center for Humanities Research, constituted as it is as a minor within the field of higher education. And in particular, I just wanted to make two broad comments. The one is that Wickham's book, You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, one of the short pieces in there is Clearing in the Bush, which is written in the building that we occupy as the Center for Humanities Research at UWC. And you heard troubled engagement in that piece about leaving the university as the celebration around Verwoerd's assassination, or the morning of Verwoerd's assassination, and the students demanding a protest about it takes hold. The other, of course, speaking about Greatmore, we had a big tussle a few years ago in the CHR about what to name that building. There's some smart aleck came up with Great More or Less, and someone else came up with Center for the Periphery. And you might just have offered us a way out of that conundrum. So on that note, I'm going to open up for some questions and comment.
Just while you do, I'll